Welcome everyone to the Chat Mode Weekly Insight Series, where we share best practices, information, and insights around chatbots, voice, and AI in the Microsoft ecosystem. And today we are very privileged to have Deborah Harrison of Microsoft. Deborah is a senior content experience manager. She leads a team of writers who are industry experts in personality design, dialogue, authoring, and machine learning. They're building an ethical and inclusive approach to voice and personality. Her work has spanned Cortana, Bot Framework, Power Virtual Agents, Personalities, and many other conversational AI initiatives at Microsoft. So Deborah, thanks again for being on live stream today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, man, there's just so much to cover today because your background in the conversational AI space, I was taking a look, actually dates back to 2001 when you were part of the natural language group at Microsoft. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, isn't that funny? I had honestly forgotten about it until not that long ago, and it kind of came up. My first Microsoft contracting job back then was working in this natural language space, and I just put some books up recently when I moved into this space, and I found some of the books they gave me at the time. Natural Language Understanding. Look, this is from the day.
From the day.
Back in the day, and look, I took notes. I probably read it and everything.
That's awesome.
I know. Still trying to tell you when I did my homework, but yeah. So the work was fascinating. It was developing some API and backend type stuff to codify the structural differences between syntactic and grammatical conditions, so that a parser could then go on to incorporate that into natural language processing. And so my job for a while was to just go through and be like, is that syntactic or is that grammatical or is that punctuational, or just like assigning classifications to these minute. And I had been in English. I was a liberal arts major, I got a liberal arts degree in English. And so just 2 years before that, I had been, doing the rounds of people telling me that I would never get a job in my area and nobody needed the skills I was building. I'd run a writing workshop for a little while, and I read grammar books for fun, and that was not going to be a career path. And so then a few years later, here I am, and Microsoft is paying me to do this kind of work. It was awesome. And so I kind of, then the role was liquidated because they decided to move to a commercial space. This has been a pure research space, if I remember correctly. And I went on to go do a bunch of other stuff and eventually landed back at Microsoft. And then when I came back to Cortana, I was going through some of the work and I was like, yeah, this is really familiar somehow. And I remember that I'd done this back then, and it was probably foundational work that ended up feeding it. It was really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so funny because annotations are still a huge part of conversational AI today. Although we've come, some significant progress when it comes to the actual models and how, a little bit easier they've become versus sort of back in the day, how they're a little bit more tedious to actually build these really cool models. Now jumping towards 2014, I don't know if many people know this, but you're actually literally the first writer for Cortana that shaped the personality and, created some of those initial conversation flows. So can you sort of elaborate on that and tell us what that journey was like and how that helped you, begin to really define the foundations when it came to conversation design?
Totally. Yeah, I was a writer on the Windows Phone project, which was a beautifully fun project that allowed Microsoft to step into a new space with respect to design and incorporating the writing discipline into design. My manager at the time I'm still with her. We've stayed in the same org all this time, and that's not entirely a coincidence because I really value the rigor that she brought to bringing design and conversation, and authoring together as co-equal disciplines. And so it was a fun job, but I was a writer who worked on features on Windows Phone. And so one year, one of the features that came around was Cortana. And it was a nice coincidence of both volunteering and being asked to join this feature that was just one of many, and it seemed like kind of interesting. And really quickly, I started working on a project to help define the hiring brief for the voice talent. And there were a couple of projects going on at the same time. That was one of them, and one was looking at what the avatar emotion spectrum ought to be. What emotions should the avatar be in a position to communicate? And then another one was about how could we code the TTS voice function to exhibit what range of emotion should that be in a position to represent. And so all of these were going on at the same time. It was a great crash course in trying to think about the different aspects of the personality spectrum. This is new work to me. I'd never worked in a digital agent space or a conversational space of this kind. So my first, the first set of writing that came my way was in dialogues for task-based scenarios. So create a reminder, set an alarm, and do email and so forth. I was working with this, extraordinary woman who is still here and still working on Cortana, Lisa Seifelman, who came out of long voice design history with the MIT Media Lab, and she's brilliant, and everybody should be very appreciative that she's doing this work. And so she had done some thinking about how to create the tree structures for how these should operate, and the query what query should trigger things, but the text hadn't been written yet. And so my job was to come in and write some text. And especially in the wake of this other kind of personality driven work that we were thinking about, the question for me was, well, how should it sound? What should the tone of it be? And it felt like the MSTP, which was still, still more a thing at the time, didn't feel like that was going to be the right model to go from. And so through conversations with the other folks that I was working with on these other projects, I went to go find out, like, how does it talk, and what does the style need to be, and what conditions do I need to conform to? And that articulation hadn't happened yet. The thinking around emotive spectrum and voice talent certainly informed the same kinds of conversations, but there hadn't been an articulation of what is the personality, how do you know it is or isn't on track? And so I volunteered to go write it up and socialize it, and worked with the other folks on the team to start coalescing these set of values that would inform the writing. And as this was happening, we were working, we were talking about naming, and would it be called Cortana? And if so, did that affect the personality in any way? And developing more and more task-based scenarios where the voice really mattered. I mean, it was really critical right away that we needed to have a clarity about what the tone should be. But then we started thinking about the chit-chat world, and that was where the rubber really hit the road in terms of how the personality was going to be expressed. What would it answer and what would it not answer, and under what circumstances would it be transparent about its nature or not? And so the more we did that, the more we were testing the limits of what the persona doctrine needed to be. And that is around the time when Jonathan Foster, who you interviewed a couple of weeks ago, joined the project. So he came on to lead what became a team specifically dedicated to this, and put a lot of structural rigor into how we could think about this and how we could socialize it and make sure it was clear to everybody who needed to do the work and build out a team. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's exciting because it's like groundbreaking work that no one had really had to answer before, right? Some of the questions that arose, because I remember from our previous conversations, you had mentioned that, when the bot or when Cortana started to get really sort of difficult questions, was the best, path forward to just not respond at all, or to actually respond in a way that was meaningful? Can you talk about that sort of shift a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we knew early on that we were going to have, resource constraint was going to play a role, right? We could only write as many responses as we had people and hours in the day to do it, which meant we had to be thoughtful about what we chose to respond to. And it would have been, I don't know, tempting is the right word, but you could have made an argument that if it's too hard and we don't know what to do, let's just not do it yet. We're going to come back to it at least. And that wasn't how we chose to do it. We went ahead and started tackling some really hard things really early on. And really shortly thereafter, we started getting, it was already in a test environment, and we had some insight into what people would say. And I think Jonathan probably mentioned the same thing, that you see people, even in a test environment, even within a Microsoft internal, you see people saying pretty dramatic things. And if they're willing to do it in an environment where they know they're being watched by their own organization, people are going to do it out in the wider world, right? So we decided to embrace it. And another thing that arose for us sort of philosophically early on was that not only was this a question that would test people's perception of how intelligent our bot could be, it was also going to, like it or not, fall on our shoulders to represent emotional and ethical and ideological perspectives. And that if we chose not to answer, I know Jonathan mentioned this too, it was huge for both of us, that if you don't answer, you are answering. If you answer other things that are profoundly trivial, which we did, and you don't answer something that is steeped in meaning, then you're making a declaration about the point of view, especially for something as high profile as Cortana. Not all bots, that's not true for all bots. For some bots, the boundaries are so clear that they wouldn't be expected to traffic in, is there a God? But people asked that of Cortana. And if we didn't answer, that was a notion. And so when people were being abusive, which happened immediately, if we answered in a conciliatory way, or in a placating way, or in a playful way, or as I've seen other developers choose to handle it in a flirtatious way, then that not only reflects on Microsoft, right? It speaks to something that Microsoft is now going to have to carry, but it also makes a larger ideological point of view, which I think is where my this is an area of real passion for me in the work, is how do we teach and write for our agents and for non-personified agents that have a natural language component in a way that reflects something that elevates our values. And I'm really careful to say that although I'm very passionate about my value system and very happy to talk about it, it's not, the intention isn't to be monolithic about what the values ought to be, but to remind people who are doing this work that if you say anything at all, you are now making a value statement, and to really advocate for people to be prepared to stand behind that statement that they're making. And if they're not, to assign the time and resource necessary to think that through carefully, because it gets reflected whether you want it to or not. So,
no, absolutely. I think, especially with conversational interfaces, like having a well-defined personality is sort of an imperative. And I think we're beginning to see that standardize across sort of the ecosystem, because I had read somewhere, it's like if you're not really careful about designing, a very defined personality, then the end user ends up sort of putting that personality onto the experience itself. And then you have people having various different experiences and then interpreting it differently, and to a great degree of effect, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So I think it's great that, the work that you guys are really building that foundation. But I'd also like to sort of step back, because it's always interesting to sort of learn about, how these best principles and best practices are being defined, because your background, extensive writer. In conjunction, you actually co-owned a coffee shop for several years as well. So I was almost curious about, did you see any parallels between the conversations, like small talk you would have at a coffee shop? Did you take any of those experiences into how you began to build the principles of how people were interacting with, Cortana?
I'm so warmed that you asked that question. I've never had anyone ask me that before. And Absolutely yes, 100% yes. It went both ways,
Yeah.
right? So the coffee shop predated Cortana. I think I can't remember exact. I'm terrible with timeline, so you can see my timeline better. But even at the time, with the coffee shop, I had a really similar, dare I say, the same ethos with opening the shop that I do with the work that I do now, which is, my husband at the time, we co-owned it together, and it was sort of a, neither of us had intended to be small business owners. That wasn't our goal and path in life. And so we talked a lot about what are we trying to create here, because he really loved coffee. And so that was, and we understood enough about the business model to understand that coffee was a viable business, even for, relative novices, if you're willing to put in a lot of time. But from my perspective, what we were doing was creating a space together. And so if you're creating that space and you are marking the threshold with doors and windows and labels and branding and what the signs look like, the baristas that you hire, the way you train them, the way you expect them to interact with your customers, the interview process, the people that you vet, or how you represent yourself in the interviews, all of those things to me it was really critical that they ladder up to our larger values of wanting to create community and positivity. And as much as it would send, my ex was hilarious. He was really good at finding places to be really funny, but we, with our branding or our t-shirts or, the punch cards and things like that, but we were careful not to use them to take pot shots at people or to, people would come in and interview and think that they would score points with us by bad mouthing Starbucks. And,
geez.
We're not enormous Starbucks fan per se. Like, I mean, he's a coffee connoisseur, and so he, it wasn't his cup of coffee.
Cup of coffee, right?
But it wasn't. We understood Starbucks's role in the ecosystem, and more importantly, we weren't looking for people who were trying to come in with negativity. In order to, because you can get coffee anywhere. There were literally 4 coffee shops within half a block of our coffee shop. You had a million other choices. And so you can get coffee absolutely anywhere. So what are you coming to our coffee shop for? And we wanted it to be for a community space of positive, social uplift. And that was nowhere in the literal branding. We didn't write it or put it on the labels or anything. We just tried to create an environment that felt like that. That's incredibly parallel to the work that I do in this space. And all of the Cortana work that I was talking about was very, very manual, right? We did all the writing, by hand and in committee, and we worked together and collaborated. And then eventually the work offered us the opportunity to move into the machine learning space. And that's a lot of what my team is right now called the content intelligence team. And that's a huge part of our focus, is looking at the back end that feeds these experiences. And so we are needing to break down these concepts of inclusivity, trust, transparency, warmth, generosity, into these component parts that can be parsed by a machine learning algorithm. Of course, the algorithm doesn't and can't care, right? Like that's not its charter. So we can't do it in training like a barista, where we say, well, like, do you care? Like we wouldn't ask that. We would ask a lot of other questions to try and get to that. And it's not entirely dissimilar, because you can't say to the algorithm, like, are you ethical? You have to like find ways to articulate questions that are meaningful, and that when you sort of shove them through the process, will then generate information that gives you the opportunity to assess that. One thing we used to do, this is my ex's clever idea, was he would ask people to tell a joke in their interview process, and it was very interesting how many people told racist jokes.
Oh, geez.
In an interview. And so, what does that mean to be racist? Those are questions where kind of almost to go back to that first thing you asked me, is going down the line, is this grammar, is this syntax? Like, is this racist? Well, what does it mean to be racist?
Yeah.
That is a big old question. And so, yeah, there's a ton of through line between all those.
Yeah, no, that's phenomenal, because when I was talking to Jonathan, it was so interesting because it was when he was thinking about creating these experiences, it's more about understanding humans, right, and how we already interact and connect. And I see that parallel with the coffee shop experience as well, because you probably have had thousands of conversations with different people, different backgrounds, and I have to think that in some way, shape, or form, those sort of learnings are getting now codified in the work you're doing, that's sort of across Microsoft's product offerings when it comes to conversation. So maybe that's actually a great segue to sort of talk more about some of the work you're doing today. And, what are some of the tangible principles you've been taking away from it for everyone watching right now that might be in the process or might be thinking about deploying a conversational experience in their own organization?
Yes. So when you ask me what am I working on now, I get a little bit the circuit gets tripped because I want to start talking about all of it.
Yeah.
So, let's see. I will try and think of a way to narrow it, but do you have do you want to see if you can
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's break it up. So maybe we can talk first about, what is your team focused on right now? Because I know there's a huge focus, and I think it's awesome that your team is like the tip of the spear when it comes to how to inject diversity, equity, inclusion into conversation design, not thinking about it as this afterthought, where it's going to be disjointed and maybe not serve the impact that you're trying to achieve. So I would love to learn about that. And I think it's just not a topic we're hearing enough. So I think it's great that you guys are focused on that.
Thank you. It's a general plea. If anybody is at any point listening and wants to talk more, I'd be thrilled. So there are a few projects that we're working on right now that really are offering us enormous opportunity to think through the minutia of what it looks like to do this work. So one is personality chat, which is it's a feature that you can get through the bot framework. That's a kit, and you can choose from 5 different personas, each one tailored to have a different personality. And the spirit of it is to offer your bot the opportunity to not fall off a cliff when chit chat comes around. So there's a feature that we are working on and getting close to have ready to offer, which is around sensitive and abusive content specifically. And so we have attended to a few different sensitive scenarios over the years of developing this, but because of the nature of this project is to allow it to be very general, we wanted to be very thoughtful and careful about offering when you take a personality chat persona, you get the responses, which are very much an expression of the work that my team does, but you also get the query set. And so that's a huge benefit. You could throw away all of our answers if you don't like them all, and you can make them all, you can make a flirt bot or a racist bot or whatever. You can make one that only talks about pizza or something.
Right.
But the query set is still available. And so when you are dealing in these abusive areas, you also need to be offering a data set that deals with a lot of abusive queries, and we want to be very thoughtful about how we offer that to people. So, we've created some scenarios that specifically address that. It is very hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
You have to really sit with people's intentions. And so some of the sensitive areas are not abusive at all. Some of them are just questions that it would be easy to handle poorly if you're not habituated to sitting with the kind of identity awareness that we try to cultivate. So things like, are you gay? Or, I'm being abused, something like that. But then others are examples of being sexually aggressive or sexually inappropriate, or in some cases just sexually explicit, which in some context is fine, but it's not, a lot of bots, that's not where they want to go. And then areas where they're just being, overtly racist or, committing some kind of identity slur. So how do you, how do you decide how you respond when somebody is being overtly abusive? When the intent is to harm. And we have taken the stance in the work we do here, and you can see that in what's already out there, both in Cortana and in Personality Chat to some extent, is to do what we can to model what we consider a healthy boundary. So we are careful not to pretend that we don't understand. We try to make sure that the response feels intelligent so that it feels connected to the query that was asked. And we try to imagine what it would feel like to be somebody of the identity that's being attacked, who is in a position to respond safely. Speaking for myself, in circumstances where people have said abusive things to me, in particular, gender coded, I often do not feel safe in the moment, pushing back in a way that would feel fulfilling to me. Occasionally, yes, that it has happened. But often, if I'm in that circumstance, the whole environment is designed to make me feel vulnerable, and I am vulnerable, and I don't feel that I can, represent this sort of strength. So we like to imagine and embody, because you can't hurt the bot, like it's not something. What would it look like to respond in a way that held that line to say this is not acceptable to me? So we look for that. We look for those opportunities. I could go on and on about that, but so other projects we work on in this area. We work on a project called Editor. It's in Microsoft Word, and it's available in some browsers as well, where you can ask your Word to offer you insights on your writing. And you can think of it as the natural extension of the red squiggle that checked your spelling. And it's getting more sophisticated in the kind of advice it can offer. There is now a setting in Word called inclusive language. And if you choose to turn it on, then the product will offer you feedback if it sees that you've used words that may not be as inclusive as maybe you would intend. And so the spirit of this is that this is for people who have asked for this feedback, right? Like they're wanting it. And so part of the journey in this work is to look for ways to offer these insights in a gentle way that would feel like it honors people's intentions here. That we're trying not to point fingers or tell people that that they're what kind of person they are as a result of the language that they've used, and also an understanding with our humility that we don't know. It's very reasonable, for example, to cite, to use certain language in a citation or to reference something with which you may be arguing or disagreeing, right? And so there's this component of how do we offer guidance that feels supportive. There's also an interesting discovery around how do we figure out what to respond to, right? Like what language is productive, to look at there. So we also work on other products where we are we're paying attention to under what circumstances would it be less productive to either respond to a word that's being used or to use a particular word in a response. And so there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff that goes on. This is related to work we did in Cortana as well, and with Personality Chat, where we were training the model. How do you respond to certain in certain circumstances in an algorithmic way? So you sort of build this whole function to do its best to represent the voices that we had designed in each of those personas. But we don't want it to say inappropriate stuff, right? So we'd have to create a block list, among other things, to tell it, but just don't ever say, never say this word. And in other circumstances, we would maybe have a similar list, but instead of saying, well, don't say it, say, if the query includes this word, it's best to lay off because you're unlikely to be in a position to do justice to that topic or that subject. So all of that is, well understood territory. These have been around forever. But our team is trying to find ways to create some articulation around how you might think about it editorially. There, an uncountable number of intelligent and talented folks are thinking about the code, how to make it work. But in our areas of intersection, we find these patterns that come up over and over around how you identify risk from an editorial perspective. And are there patterns that we can pay attention to that will help shortcut that process for each team that needs to go through it? It's a really interesting area to explore what that can look like, because we bring all this experience of sitting and reckoning with this really hard stuff. And our team, I'm really careful to say this, that we are not even, for a long time, everybody on the Cortana team was white.
Yeah.
Everybody. And all of us live in the Pacific Northwest and work for Microsoft and, however much diversity we're able to bring into the room with a variety of other backgrounds and identities. And now my team is more racially diverse and more geographically diverse in some ways. But even so, we've all made the choice to come live here, and we've all made the choice to work in this industry, and we all have the set of privileges that are attended by that. And so we are very careful to remind over and over ourselves to be we build it into the process to acknowledge with humility the places where we are not in a position to speak for anybody else. But yet it is our job to do our best to do it. And so what does it look like to build a process in a team whose role it is to try to represent, work with, arbitrate these notions of identity without appropriating or trying to speak for identities that we do not inhabit. And it's tricky, and and I'm very, very invested in finding out ways. I know there are a lot of other people who've thought about this too, and anybody out there, if you have thoughts for me on this, I'm very much eager to learn how. I want to keep doing this better because everybody understands resource constraints. We are incredibly lucky to have more than one person on this at all. I know that most operations do not have more than, and that one person is probably writer and designer and half coder, right? Like, so to sit here and, be like, oh, we only have 6 people, I know, I get it. But we also know that 6 people is not, no 6 people will be able to speak for everybody. And so, so we're really interested in what kinds of best practices are emerging from our work that might be helpful for other folks to pay attention to too. So.
No, it's so like some of the product offerings you were just mentioning it sounds like that one data set is about to be released, or it's something that you guys are still working on?
Personality chat. I don't want to promise any dates, but we're hoping it won't be too long before we're ready to share that one.
Yeah, no, that's exciting because I know that you guys were very instrumental in, the personality chat. And I think you can leverage that in Q&A Maker and in Lewis, where it changes sort of the tone, professional, or sort of more, I guess, informal and humorous. So, for people that want to check that out, definitely go check some of those out on those existing features. And then the other data that you're mentioning, I think that's just awesome because, I think it's just an error. I think, when we think about conversational AI in general, right, it's like all of these areas are breaking new ground, right? From the technology to what is conversation design to ensuring that it's inclusive. So I think, by working on these things and then enabling people to include these into their experiences, I think it just makes them better for everyone at the end of the day. So I think that's awesome. So now I sort of want to transition a little bit to Can you talk about some of the best practices that you guys have uncovered so far? Principles that, for people that are looking to build these digital assistants, like what would you suggest to them?
Absolutely. So I am going to talk in a way that I know, however rigorous I intend to be, I'm going to end up speaking from the experience of having a team.
Yeah.
And so I want to acknowledge up front that again, I understand the embarrassment of riches we have by having a team that does this. That said, it is my considered and strong recommendation that no one person try to tackle this alone. So if you don't have a team of writers, and you can't get a team of writers, I nevertheless I cannot recommend highly enough finding a way to bring other people into the process of developing the voice, in particular in the part where you're reckoning with these areas of sensitivity. I don't think any one person is equipped to guess well enough, and all of us need a lot of support, emotional support, to navigate the really tricky areas here. I know this has been in the news for years that that a lot of the people who do the evaluative work behind the scenes are sometimes exposed to some really horrific stuff.
Yeah.
And while in our world we're anticipating the horrific rather than responding to it, it still takes an emotional toll. And so I really want to advocate for people to honor whatever discomfort they may end up feeling in the result of doing this work, and encourage you not to feel like you need to shoulder it by yourself. It's not. I would say it's not strictly healthy to try.
Yeah, totally.
So that caveat aside, collaborative work is the best practice that I cannot recommend highly enough. Our process, when we're doing this kind of evaluative or generative discovery work, is to identify the areas that we want to give thought to, work in our own habit holes, and then come back as a group regularly. And my team, we are currently meeting 5 times a week. We have in fallow periods gone down as low as 3 times a week, but we meet very, very regularly to do the analysis work together. So for the strictly evaluative, when you're running down in the machine learning, massive sets of data, you're going to want to have a statistically meaningful number of people working on it, because one person is statistically meaningless and 2 people create a tie, right? And so so any of you working on this, I'm sure already know this, but 3 is a good start. But you go off and you do your thinking, or you're deciding, or you're brainstorming, you're iterating, and then you come back together. So collaborative work is a principle, I feel it would be very hard to do without. Principle development. So you mentioned you mentioned principles. Principles are I'm going to say it anyway, even though I don't love how cliche this is going to be, but it's both the journey and a destination. Right?
Yeah.
So in our process, we typically will get a brand new project, we'll do a lot of digging in on it, and we'll fiddle with it, and we'll sort of, anticipate some of the principles that are likely to be in a component of helping us create alignment. But generally, we go in first, we do the work, and we start paying attention to the patterns that emerge. And as soon as possible, we start collecting and documenting those patterns. And then as soon as possible after that, we start coalescing them into some principles. And then from then on, once we've socialized them with all the people who need to be, either informed or to sign off or to offer their feedback, from then on, it might be tempting to park it and leave it. And we never do that. It is always a living document. Those principles always evolve. And, even when we make them, like, we are not designers, and I have a little bit of designer envy. of people who can just like make it super pretty. And I was wishing I could do that. When we occasionally get the opportunity to make it super pretty, it can be even more tempting to be like, oh, we can't change it. You know, no, it's living and it needs to evolve, and new information comes in and tests it. And so with Cortana, we ended up having a new articulation of the principles roughly yearly. And that is a complete coincidence from my perspective. I don't intend it to be a yearly thing, but around once a year, we would have a new need for the new project parameters to reflect something that we hadn't considered before, or that rendered some of the old principles slightly obsolete. So I am, you know, my team will, I hope, speak kindly about me in this way, but I'm very principle driven. And whenever we are working on anything that requires habituated and collective understanding, I'm very careful to give us the opportunity to find a place to bank the common ground. And I also highly recommend creating a repository for examples. So in our, you know, you make these beautiful declarations about like Cortana is always transparent. What does it look like to not be transparent? Like how would you know you're failing at that? And under what circumstances would that come under challenge? Those do nots, almost it's become something pretty common for us at this point to do when we create our principal documents for anybody else to see. We'll often have an example of what it looks like to do this in its fullest realization of our intentions. And then we usually have two examples of how not to do it. And one represents the kind of extreme, you know, the sort of, you know, it would be probably obvious, but it's helpful for people to see it in action. You know, so if you're saying, you know, be transparent, you might show, you know, the query. I'm doing this from memory, so bear with me, but it's something like, you know, are you a bot? And so you might have an example of something we might say, which would be something like, you know, are you human? Maybe better. And you say, no, I'm a digital agent. If you need to talk to a human, you know, something like that. An example of don't do this would be like, heck yeah, you know, really like, don't do, you know, that is not transparent. You're lying. But then we almost always have another example that's like close.
Yeah.
You know, like more likely that it would be something like if you're the writer, you could reasonably think, well, I'm being pretty transparent here, but it's not quite right, which would be something like maybe sarcasm might be an example of that. Something, so if you say, are you human? And you say like, oh, you know, would you ask, I can't think of a bot's name, you know, like, would you ask the Terminator that or something, you know, something like,
right.
We're not saying no, but you're making a joke out of it. And that's not transparent either. Like, this is a serious question. This isn't intended to joke around. And so we like to compile examples like that help give you the guardrails, but then also the like softer, you know, guidance of that kind. Let's see, what else? Revisiting the principles, testing it often. So when people build their projects, this must come up every time, right? Like if people want to ship and then go on to the next thing. It's like,
totally.
Of course you want to do that. But especially in work like this, it is very hard to know whether you've done a good job by the metrics that you set for yourself, unless you go back and see how people are responding to it over and over. And this is not just about persona, this is about everything. So what does that require? Well, it requires building a system that can support metric gathering. And so it's a need that you have as an editorial team or as a design team, but it's a dependency on your development team to enable you to be able to harvest that kind of information. It's night and day when you can have that versus when you can't. And so that's the thing I like to advocate for. Should I keep? I'll pause. Those are some.
No, this is great. I'll try to, I guess, reiterate from what you were saying. So you said the first thing was, you know, just ensure that you have sort of a diverse and inclusive team to make sure to get as many perspectives as possible, which makes total sense. You know, and I think it's something whether it's AI and bias, whether it's diversity when we're talking about building these solutions, or even what is the messaging at the end of the experience. So that sounds to me like the first thing. And then the second thing you said, really focus on fostering collaboration amongst the team dynamics to ensure that, one person just isn't working on maybe, a couple dialogues and they just never get feedback. So very collaborative process. And then you also said to build out a knowledge repository, right? Just don't write a bunch of stuff and then, lose it, just make sure that you're building that over the time. Something I liked what you said was you have a lot of, you build examples and then counter examples, what it should be and then what it definitely shouldn't be. Which I think is great because there's a lot of parallels in that when it comes to branding. When you build these brand guidelines, you have what you're trying to convey and what you're definitely not trying to convey sometimes. And then I think the last point you said was, have this data-driven iterative process. So make sure that you can build in KPIs that are very much aligned so you can evaluate, and not just, ship it and forget about it, but to really ensure that you have and can sustain and optimize a great experience. And I think those are all great points that, sort of apply across the development of a conversational experience, from the personality to the actual dialogue and copy. I think those are great principles for anyone really considering to build out an experience to really take the heart and follow. So extending that a little bit, I know a lot of people that are probably listening to this are probably building maybe more task-driven experiences. But I think with the rapid advancement of conversational AI, we're beginning to see more personality-driven experiences. And if we actually date back to some of the early chatbots like Eliza, which was actually this, psychology-driven chatbot, and it seems from, certain studies that people are actually more comfortable talking to a chatbot because they know that it's not a real person. Yeah. So Deborah, what do you see? Are you seeing more applications for maybe mental health chatbots or chatbots that can try and address problems that people typically have a difficulty, talking about certain topics?
Yes. Yes. And I keep trying to just answer the question you asked me, and I'm not. I keep wanting to go a little farther than that. So I'm going to do that, and then you feel free to pull me back.
Cool. No, more information is great.
Okay, so I'm really interested in what conversation is good for in a digital space. It's because it went through something of a fad over the last few years. Right. And I'm not, no shade, yeah. I'm not, totally. I'm in the biz. Yeah. But it was a bit of a hot idea for a little while. And I am quite confident in, again, no shade, saying that a lot of people went into bot development without a lot of clarity about what it was going to offer their business. And also, maybe more importantly, how labor intensive it is to do it effectively. I'm a believer that conversation, that natural language interaction, maybe more technically, is and should be a parallel line UX option. That because of how many people have natural language already as a interactive model that is built in for them. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. The ability for people to interact in a natural language way with their apps and services and devices would unlock the usability and accessibility options for an uncountable number of people if it worked the way we in the industry all wish it did. So if we could fast forward to that future where it really does that level of heavy lifting, where we've solved a lot of the conversational understanding difficulties and where we've created something that's scalable for query evaluation and error handling and the really hot, heavy lifting kinds of aspects of this work. And you can imagine it as a ubiquitous function, then it unlocks so many possibilities for what good it could offer. So to your question specifically, can it be useful for people who don't, who for whatever reasons, you can speculate a whole variety of them, would feel more comfortable being able to converse? I mean, absolutely. Why not? Right. And at the same time, you have to acknowledge, just with like every single powerful technology that's ever existed, there is also the opportunity to use it for great harm. And so the question of whether we need to or should build conversational experiences on behalf of people who would feel more comfortable also begs the question of what societal need is that filling that doesn't exist that maybe we could also put some time and effort towards, right? And so I don't want to sort of what if it out of, out of consideration, but I would like to see those conversations happening in parallel. Why is it harder for people to talk to people? Well, is it the structural system of people that it's hard to talk to in those circumstances, and is there anything we do about that? But that said, natural language is almost unfathomably powerful if you can lay the pipe appropriately. And questions around disambiguation, I think, are, right? You all and everybody's listening. Like, it's amazing what you can do to get people from I have no idea what to ask to I need to go down this pipeline, and maybe now I deal with a person or whatever, by a series of almost like Eliza-like questions, like a series of thoughtful, sort of narrowing of scope to get you to where you need to go. And not only does that offer you the opportunity to apply resource appropriately for the highly technical expertise that you need to offer. I mean, I'm speaking specifically to chatbots, but really you can extrapolate it out into a whole variety of different scenarios. The thing that happens for the person ideally is that they have become educated along the way about what their options are in a way that may shortcut that for them in the future, may habituate them to certain areas of their apps and devices that would have been opaque to them. It's enormous. The possibilities are so extraordinary. So again, I'm answering it kind of bigger than I think you were getting at. So feel free to, pull me back. But those are the wheels that turn when I think about the value to people in these areas of high complexity and high sensitivity, high vulnerability. The other thing I would add to that is that, we kind of joke that for every person you remove from the process with code, you have to add that same person back in for, sensitivity and editorial oversight. And it's, and that's, there's a pretty beautiful way you could look at that, right? Like, bringing sort of the artistic model, closer to the place where we get to be artistic. When I'm writing dialogue for a digital agent, I feel in that moment that I am connecting with the person who might be using it. It's a very sort of physiological, I'm having the same sort of sets of chemicals and hormones that fire as if I were talking to you. Right. At least ideally, because for me it is a conversation, and I think to have the value that we would love to espouse for a scenario like that, where we are offering people for any number of really reasons that don't even need they don't need our judgment, may have limitations around talking to people. They still deserve that same empathy in that moment that they would have had if they were talking to a person who were showing up and caring to. And so for me, that's a lot of what this work offers, is the opportunity to anticipate those moments of connection and try to provide them as carefully as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great answer, because I think as we begin to walk up this staircase of complexity when it comes to conversational experiences, from purely simple task driven to interjecting personality and getting to, these more intimate conversational experiences, I think to your point, there has to be an increased degree of thoughtfulness, intentionality, and moreover responsibility into these experiences that we're building. And I think that's a great takeaway for anyone considering to build these solutions, because at the end of the day, it is really about understanding the human at the end of that experience. And it's, to your point, right? It's not just like one-on-one, right? You're literally, it's at scale, right? It could be hundreds, millions of people that it's touching. So I think that's a really great point.
Can I add something to that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, please. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I want to make sure I want to take a second to springboard off of that thought to tie it back to the value of having a lot of people involved in the process. You can tell I care so much about this. It matters to me a lot. My cultural and identity, socioeconomic, racial, gender, like all of those identity markers, experiences are going to be reflected in the work that I write and what I write. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But a thing that also happens, and that I think we're really ready to give further attention to, is that the blind spots that I have go unevaluated if it's just me, right? And so even if it's just a room of white people, right, or a room of people with a lot of overlap in terms of how they have come through the world sort of culturally. I was thinking about this. For a while, I was the only woman on the Cortana team, which everybody from top down agreed was horrendous. Nobody liked that, right? But there was no opportunity to hire at that point unless somebody quit. And so I felt like I was representing women, and it's a heavy burden. Yeah. I am one woman, and I'm a woman who spent a lot of time thinking about women and what it is to be a woman in the world. Cisgender, I'm straight, I'm the age that I am, like I'm all those, and I'm a woman. And so the notion of default is something that I'm interested in, that the amalgamation of people whose voices are a part of the process by nobody's, even with best intention, are going to find expression in those conversations. And so however careful and passionate and empathetic I am in the authoring process for those experiences, I think there's a really good chance that the work is going to come out feeling culturally white, and so and that there's going to be a sort of default feeling to that it's like, well, it's neutral, is it neutral though? Like, how neutral is it? Right. And so to go back to what we were talking about before about trying to create an inclusive team, everybody's got resource constraints. That's right. We have, if Microsoft had, we all got. But there must be ways to expand the number of voices who are a component of things, and so that we can. And we're looking at those ways too. And I know other people are as well, but I'm really eager to have conversations about what that looks like to avoid this sort of feeling of default neutrality that is truly not neutral because of the cocktail of voices that are in a position to contribute. So I wanted to circle back to that partly as a pitch for, collaborative development, but also as a pitch for humility in the face of the collaboration you're in a position to compile, if that makes sense.
Definitely. No, I think this was a great almost extension of like our conversation that we had with Stephen a couple of weeks, or must have been a month ago at this point. But absolutely. So if you're watching right now and you have an interest in these areas in regards to like how you can bring about more diversity into these technologies, make sure to definitely reach out to Deborah. She'll have super, interesting and really insightful conversations around these topics. And, I think more work and effort needs to go into this research. So definitely make sure to reach out. I know we're at the end of the hour, but I always like to ask one last question to all of my guests. Especially, in technology areas where there's ambiguity, right? There's not set practices or standards. What keeps you motivated at the end of the day? What keeps you inspired?
I have to pause, or else I'll just like, be very excited. I do not want to sound like a cop out or to dodge it. I will work my way towards something that's a little more specific. But given the heavy and urgent demands of our time, they're not new to our time, but our burgeoning ability and willingness to engage with these programs or these concepts is at a critical moment that deserves all the attention we can throw at it. Given that, there's almost nothing about the work that I do that doesn't in some way, I think, intersect with or feed our ability to be thoughtful and intentional about where we are going. In tech, we all know there's this beautiful tension that's always going. I don't really ascribe to this sort of criticism of tech that it's that people don't care about, that all they care about is shipping or whatever. Like, I work with very thoughtful people who do want to do the work, but there are always constraints, and we always have to ship. All of us do all the time. At some point you have to just let it go out the door. But with work like this, the work is to sit with and have the willingness to engage with these things that are almost terrifyingly hard sometimes, because you feel speaking for myself, it can feel like nothing we do will be, it will be enough, and it's something. And yet every day we get together and we get to reckon with it. And you know what happens? We make progress. We do. It gets better. The work gets better. The work gets easier. We find ways. We see patterns. We experience opportunities for connection that without that effort, without that investment, can pass by and can get swallowed in the ecosystem of needing to ship that I am not condemning. I understand you got to get stuff done. But for me, the opportunity to engage with work that I see as critical to creating an intentional direction for what we build as a culture, as an industry, as a people, I'm overwhelmed with how lucky I am to get to do this work, and how fortunate I am to get to do this work. It's there was a long period where I was just in it for the paycheck. I had to support my family, and the work was fine. I didn't mind it or anything, but I was just like, I just needed to have insurance. Like, I would do what it took, but and I still need insurance. It's still really important. But I think the work is offering all of us the opportunity to evolve and to have agency in what we become. And I'm very grateful. Yeah.
I love the answer. Really appreciate the conversation, all the insight, all the energy that you had to share with us today around conversational AI and how we're really bridging that gap and making sure that it's inclusive. So on that note, Deborah, thank you so much. And we'll definitely have you come back again.
Definitely. Let's do it again.
Cool. Let's do it. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.